Hi, my name's Nick Hildyard. I work for a small solidarity and research group in the UK. I've been active on water issues in the Euphrates and Tigris basin for 20 years or so. And I was also involved in the campaign to stop the Ilisu Dam in the Kurdish region of Turkey, a campaign I'm sure many of you know about. I had planned to be with you today, but for family reasons, I've been unable to travel. But I'm with you in spirit. I think this is a really critically important and timely meeting, and I send my solidarity and my thanks to the organisers for inviting me to participate. I'd like to share some thoughts on water as a vehicle for peace rather than violent conflict. And I'd like to do so because many, particularly policymakers, have spun a myth that water has always been a source of antagonism, and that those who rely on shared sources of water are forever condemned to live in a perpetual state of violence or near violence. In fact, the reverse is true. Water has historically been a catalyst not for conflict, but for peace. Certainly, shared waterways have been a source of rivalries, of disputes, of conflicting social and economic interests, and of course, of tensions. And certainly, there have been instances where violence has erupted over access to water. But, and this is a crucial point, violence between nations or violence over water as a scarce resource have been very, very rare. That isn't to deny that water is currently being weaponized by many states, Turkey being an example, and I know you've got many sessions discussing that. But when policymakers claim that the resulting conflicts are rooted in a scarcity of water rather than in politics, they're simply wrong. They're misleading. Where conflict, violent or otherwise, has erupted, it's very rarely because of an absolute scarcity of water. Instead, conflict results from politically generated scarcities, rooted in inequalities of power that enable one group to deny access to water to another group or to degrade the environment at the expense of others. In effect, water conflicts are always about politics. The inequalities in power that give rise to water conflicts they're not God-given. They're directly related to processes of capital accumulation, patriarchy, imperialism, corporate and state expansion at the expense of the commons, and ambition for hegemonic control. And if those of you in Rojava who rely on the river Kabul, and I hope I've pronounced that right, don't have water, this is not an act of God. It's because Turkish-backed militia have cut the supply. If people can't drink water in Basra because it is too saline, this is not an act of God. It's a result of decisions that have been made by Pacific people with specific political and economic interests that have led to poor drainage, reduced downstream flows of water, increased salinization, and increased levels of chemical runoff into the waterways. It's those decisions and the powers behind them that have rendered the water undrinkable. And if people are denied water because they can't pay for it, this again is not an act of God, but a direct outcome of unjust economic policies and privatization of water supplies. Whether in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world, water scarcity today is primarily politically generated water scarcity. These conflicts won't be addressed simply by improving technologies, because the struggle is not a technological one. It's a struggle against imbalances of political, economic, and social power. It's a struggle for democracy. Whose voice counts? Whose environment gets protected? And whose gets impacted? Who gets to enjoy the benefits? Whose needs get to be met? And because it's a struggle over who controls decision making, collaboration in the use of water requires more than simply creating forums in which water can be negotiated in the abstract. I mean, for example, during the time I've been involved in water issues in Mesopotamia, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq have, throughout that period, 20 years or more, been conducting secret, behind-the-scenes water negotiations. The forum for negotiations exists, but imbalances in power have left Turkey entirely dominant in the negotiations, to the extent that it can dictate the outcomes. Addressing that inequality of negotiating power is essential, and that will require social and environmental movements in the region and internationally, not only to pressure Turkey, but to pressure NATO, to pressure the European Union, to pressure the United States, to pressure Russia, to pressure the United Nations, and to pressure other international actors who can hold Turkey to account. And it's not just the power relations between those negotiating or having the forum that matters. Who takes part in the negotiation is also of critical importance. Restricting access to government officials and their corporate allies will yield very different results than if affected communities and civil society organizations are directly involved. And frankly, that's hardly surprising. If you're the boss of a corporation, water is simply an input, a cost of production, and a source of profit. But for those who depend on water for their livelihoods, those who depend directly on the land, water is survival. When communities have the deciding say, their rules reflect that survival imperative. And here I'd like to consider an example of the rules that have emerged from a very famous, decades-long community-led struggle in India to restore the Alwar watershed in Rajasthan. Rajasthan is a desert area whose annual rainfall is even less than the rainfall received in Syria. And years of deforestation by logging companies and tube well extraction by large farmers had depleted aquifers in the watershed, causing the river Alwar to dry up in summer months. And to combat this, villagers came together to restore hundreds of small village ponds known as johads that had silted up due to the increased deforestation and the resulting erosion. Each pond was managed by a village council, which enforced its own rules for collaborative water management. And at a watershed level, the communities came together to form a water parliament, whose rules included, and I enumerate just a few of them: 1. Not allowing exploiters and polluters into the area. 2. Being on guard against privatization forces. 3. Conserving the environment. 4. Seeking drought-resistant crops. And 5. Not growing cash crops. There were many more. Now, these are rules that would never emerge from a state or corporate-driven negotiating process. They're rules that reflect the priorities of what I call the commons. And by commons, I mean those ways of social and economic organizing that recognize and seek to put into practice the collective right of all, not just the few, to survival. That for me is the commons. And while the Alwa Parliament has absolutely no legal authority, it does have moral authority. And it's been able to impose fines on rule breakers and to resolve resource use disputes between villages. And the result is that during the 1990s and early 2000s, the Alwa River began to flow again all year round. Groundwater resources have been restored, local wells have been replenished, and the forests have been brought back to life. And there's a wonderful video of the struggle, which I would urge you to watch. I'll give the URL, the link to the forum's organizers. But the achievements of the communities in Alwa and indeed elsewhere in the world in restoring and collaboratively managing water resources are not easily replicated. They rely on more than a set of template institutions that once in place somehow guarantee water democracy. Their success lies in their active daily promotion of collaboration. Because water harvesting is about more than simply obtaining water. It's about building society through an active process of challenging undemocratic, unjust, inequitable, and discriminatory practices wherever and whenever they arise. And it's this activism that ultimately engenders the solidarities that make for collaboration. The struggle isn't to obtain H2O, just a collection of molecules, nor to put in place new institutional structures that benefit one group over another, but to build and defend water justice and democracy through active daily commoning as a verb, democratic confederalizing as a verb. I'll leave it there, and I'd just like to say thank you again for inviting me, and you have my solidarity and my ongoing commitment to the work that you've helped to initiate. Thank you.